In 1948, a man was found dead on an Australian beach, well-dressed, no wallet, no ID. Sewn into a secret pocket of his trousers was a scrap of paper with two words, Tamam Shud. In Persian, that means it is finished. This is MrPhantom, and tonight we are covering one of the most disturbing unsolved identity mysteries in modern history. A case that baffled investigators for over 7 decades. A case with a secret code, a possible spy, a woman who knew more than she ever admitted, and a DNA breakthrough that answered one question while making everything else darker and stranger than before. This is the Somerton Man. To understand why this case gripped the world, you need to understand what was found. Not just the body, not just the paper, everything. Because this case is not one mystery. It is a series of mysteries stacked on top of each other, and every time investigators peeled back one layer, they found something underneath that made less sense than what came before. December 1st, 1948, Somerton Beach, Adelaide, South Australia. It was a warm summer evening on the southern Australian coast. The kind of evening when people came to the beach to walk and breathe and feel the ocean air. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, witnesses noticed a man lying on the beach near the crypt's steps, a set of stairs leading down from the esplanade to the sand. He was well dressed, lying on his back, his head resting against the seawall, his legs crossed at the ankle, in a posture that looked almost deliberate, almost peaceful. Some witnesses assumed he was sleeping. One witness noticed his arm move slightly during the evening, which suggested he was alive. Another witness noticed a cigarette on his collar, as though it had fallen from his lips while he relaxed. The next morning, December 2nd, the man had not moved. He never would again. When police arrived and examined him, they found a man of approximately 40 to 45 years of age, physically fit, well-built, around 5 feet 11 inches tall. He was wearing a well-tailored suit with the labels removed. His shirt, tie, and shoes were clean and in good condition. His shoes showed minimal wear, suggesting they were either new or very rarely used. His hands showed no signs of heavy manual labor. He had good teeth with a specific dental configuration that would later become one of the few physical identifiers available to investigators. There was no wallet, no identification documents, no keys, no hat, which was unusual for a well-dressed man in 1948, no ticket stubs, no receipts, nothing with a name or an address or any indication of who this man was or where he had come from. The labels had been removed from every piece of clothing he wore, deliberately removed, every single one. This was not carelessness, this was intention. A post-mortem examination was conducted, and here is where the first layer of the mystery opens. The pathologist could not determine the cause of death. There were signs of congestion and hemorrhage consistent with poisoning, but no poison was identified in the analysis available at the time. The examination noted that the man appeared to have been in excellent health prior to whatever killed him. His last meal appeared to have been a pasty, a common Australian meat pastry, consumed several hours before death. His blood showed unusual changes that some medical experts interpreted as consistent with certain types of poison, but nothing could be confirmed. The cause of death was officially listed as unknown. A healthy, well-dressed, unidentified man with deliberately removed clothing labels found dead on a public beach with no confirmed cause of death. That alone would have been a significant mystery. But then investigators found the suitcase. In the weeks following the discovery of the body, a suitcase was located at Adelaide railway station that had been checked in on November 30th, the day before the body was found. The suitcase had no identifying name tag. Investigators determined it likely belonged to the Somerton man based on circumstantial matching of clothing items inside. The suitcase contained clothing, several items. Again, the labels had been removed from almost everything. However, on one item, a tie, and on a laundry bag inside the case, a name had been written in thread, Keen or Keen. This was one of very few name traces found across the entire case. It led nowhere definitive. The clothing in the suitcase included items of mixed origin, some Australian, some possibly American. This detail quietly fueled early speculation about whether the man was a foreign national, a traveler, or someone operating deliberately outside normal identification channels. For months, the body lay unidentified in the Adelaide morgue. Police distributed descriptions across Australia and internationally. No missing person person's report matched. No family came forward. No employer reported an absent worker. No landlord noticed a tenant who had not returned. It was as though this man had stepped out of thin air onto Somerton Beach and simply ceased to exist. And then came the paper. In July 1949, 7 months after the body was discovered, a second examination of the dead man's clothing revealed something that had been missed. In a small fob pocket, a tiny concealed pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers, investigators found a tightly rolled piece of paper. It was printed paper, not handwritten, torn from a book. On it were 2 words in Persian script, Tamam Shud. It is finished. The phrase comes from the final line of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of Persian poetry written in the 11th century and widely translated into English. The most famous English translation, by Edward Fitzgerald, had been in circulation since the mid-1800s and was well known in the English-speaking world by 1948. But the piece of paper found in the hidden pocket was not torn from just any edition of the Rubaiyat. It was torn from a rare and specific edition, a particular print run, and investigators, once they knew what they were looking for, began trying to find the book from which that page had been torn. This is where the investigation took its most extraordinary turn. A man in Adelaide came forward after hearing about the search. He had found a copy of the Rubaiyat in the back seat of his car, which had been parked near Somerton Beach around the time the body was discovered. He had kept it without thinking much about it. When investigators examined the book, they confirmed that the final page had been torn and that the torn fragment matched precisely. This was the book, but inside the back cover of that book, investigators found something that had not been there when the book was first published. A handwritten code, 5 lines of letters, written in pencil, in what appeared to be a deliberate cipher. The letters were grouped irregularly and had no obvious pattern that matched any standard cipher system investigators could identify. The first line was later crossed out, as though whoever wrote it had reconsidered or made an error, but the remaining 4 lines remained. Cryptographers worked on the code. Naval intelligence was consulted. In the years and decades that followed, amateur and professional code breakers around the world attempted to crack it. None succeeded definitively. Some proposed theories about the structure, suggesting it might be an initialized code using first letters of words in a message, or that it required a key document to decrypt, but the key was never found. The code has never been broken. The Rubaiyat also contained something else, a phone number, a local Adelaide telephone number, written in the same pencil on the inside of the cover. Investigators traced the number. It belonged to a woman living in Glenelg, a suburb of Adelaide approximately a mile from Somerton Beach. Her name was Jessica Ellen Thomson. When police visited Jessica Thomson and asked whether she knew the man whose body had been found on Somerton Beach, she said she did not. But when she was shown a cast of the dead man's face, the reaction that witnesses present in the room described was not the reaction of a stranger seeing a stranger. She appeared visibly distressed. She appeared to know what she was looking at, and yet she maintained firmly that she did not recognize him and could not identify him. Jessica Thomson was a young woman in her late 20s at the time. She was a nurse. She would later become a nurse educator. She was intelligent, composed, and in every public interaction with investigators, she was careful with her words in a way that struck those interviewing her as significant. She acknowledged one thing. She said she had previously owned a copy of the Rubaiyat and that she had given it to a man she knew, a man she identified only as an acquaintance, sometime before the body was found. She described this man in terms that suggested a romantic or, at minimum, an emotionally significant connection, but she would not provide his name. She would not elaborate. She maintained for the rest of her life, and Jessica Thomson lived until 2007, that she could not fully explain her connection to the events on Somerton Beach. She took what she knew to her grave. Jessica Thomson had a son. His name was Robin, born in 1947. Robin grew up and lived a relatively private life. He died in 2009, but in the years when investigators and researchers were actively examining the case, several people noted that Robin Thomson had physical characteristics that were strikingly similar to the features of the Somerton man, as reconstructed by forensic artists. The ear shape, the facial structure, the unusual physical trait of a specific toe configuration called agenesis of the 5th toenail, meaning the little toe had no nail, a rare inherited condition. Both the Somerton man and Robin Thomson appeared to share this trait. The implication identification was obvious to anyone following the case, but it remained for decades an implication, an observation, nothing that could be confirmed without DNA, and the Somerton man had been cremated in 1949, with only hair samples and other minimal biological material preserved. Now we need to step back from the personal details for a moment and look at the larger picture. Because the Somerton man case did not exist in isolation, it existed in 1948 in Adelaide, in Australia, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, at the very beginning of the Cold War. The world in 1948 was a world of active espionage on a scale that most people today do not fully appreciate. The intelligence services of multiple nations were operating globally, running agents, managing dead drops, using codes and ciphers and deliberate misdirection as standard tools of professional work. The Soviet Union and the Western powers were already engaged in the shadow conflict that would define the next 4 decades. Australia in 1948 was not a neutral backwater. It was an active partner of British and American intelligence operations. Adelaide specifically was home to significant defense infrastructure. The Woomera Rocket Testing Range, one of the most strategically significant military research sites in the British Commonwealth, was in South Australia and was being actively developed in 1948. The physicist and spy Klaus Fuchs, who passed nuclear secrets to the Soviets, was arrested in 1950. Australian intelligence services had known Soviet penetration concerns throughout this period. A well-dressed, fit, unidentified man with removed clothing labels, a hidden pocket containing a fragment of Persian poetry, an uncracked code, and a connection to a woman who refused to fully explain her knowledge of him, found dead on a beach near a major defense city with no confirmed cause of death. The intelligence agencies of the time were very aware of this case. They shared remarkably little of what they concluded. For decades, theories circulated: spy, defector, courier, a man who carried information that made him dangerous and who was silenced by parties who preferred that his identity remain unknown. None of these theories were proven, but none of them could be dismissed either, because the basic facts of the case, the deliberate removal of labels, the hidden paper, the unbroken code, the inexplicable cause of death, were all consistent with the professional tradecraft of Cold War intelligence work. 50 years passed. The case remained open. It became one of the most discussed unsolved mysteries in Australian history. It generated books, documentaries, academic papers, online communities, and endless investigation by both professional researchers and dedicated amateurs. And then, in the 21st century, technology began to catch up with the mystery. In 2009, a researcher at the University of Adelaide named Derek Abbott began working on the case using modern forensic methods. Abbott and his team successfully extracted mitochondrial DNA from the hair samples that had been preserved since 1949. Mitochondrial DNA is passed through the maternal line and can survive for long periods in hair, making it one of the most useful biological materials for identifying remains after many decades. The DNA analysis produced a mitochondrial profile for the Somerton man. This profile could be used in genealogical databases to search for maternal relatives, but in 2009, the databases were not yet large enough to produce a definitive identification. The profile was noted, the search continued, more years passed, and then came 2022. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick is a forensic genealogist, one of a relatively small number of specialists who combine traditional genealogical research with modern DNA analysis to identify unknown individuals. She had worked on other complex identification cases and had developed methods for using partial DNA matches in genealogical databases to construct family trees and narrow down identity even when a direct match was unavailable. In 2022, Dr. Fitzpatrick and her colleagues announced a result. The Somerton man had been identified. His name was Carl Webb, born in 1905 in Burwood, Victoria, Australia, an electrical engineer and instrument maker. He had lived and worked in Melbourne. He had been married to a woman named Dorothy Robertson. Their marriage had been troubled. They had separated, and Carl Webb had, at some point before December 1948, disappeared from his life in Melbourne. The identification was made through DNA analysis combined with genealogical research. Fitzpatrick's team found descendants of relatives of Carl Webb through genealogical databases. By working backward through family trees and cross-referencing with the DNA profile extracted from the preserved hair samples, they were able to construct a case that placed Carl Webb as the Somerton man with a high degree of scientific confidence. This was a genuine breakthrough. After 74 years, the man on the beach had a name: Carl Webb. Webb, electrical engineer, born in Victoria, troubled marriage, disappeared. But here is the thing about this breakthrough that investigators and researchers immediately recognized. It answered the question of identity. It did not answer any of the other questions, and in some ways it made them harder, because Carl Webb was not obviously a spy. He was not on any known intelligence service roster. He was not connected to any known Cold War operation. He was an engineer from Melbourne who had marital problems and vanished. How did he end up dead on Somerton Beach? Unknown. Why were the labels removed from his clothing? Unknown. What is the code written in the back of the Rubaiyat? Unknown. How did he die? Still unknown. And the question that the discovery of Carl Webb's identity makes more pointed rather than less. What was his connection to Jessica Thomson? Jessica Thomson was a nurse in Adelaide. Carl Webb was an engineer from Melbourne. How did they know each other? Was the Rubaiyat that Jessica Thomson said she gave to an acquaintance given to Carl Webb specifically? Did Carl Webb leave that book in the car near Somerton Beach, or did he give it to someone else who left it? If Jessica Thomson knew Carl Webb, why did she refuse for the rest of her life to name him or explain her connection to his death? And what about Robin Thomson? Jessica Thomson's son, who died in 2009, was never DNA tested before his death. The question of whether Robin was Carl Webb's biological son, the question that the physical similarities raised so loudly for so long, was never answered before Robin died. There are ongoing efforts by researchers working with appropriate ethical considerations to obtain DNA from Robin Thomson's remains for comparison. As of the most recent publicly available information, this comparison has not yet been formally completed or published. If Robin Thomson was Carl Webb's son, it would mean that Carl Webb and Jessica Thomson had a relationship that Jessica worked for the rest of her life to conceal. It would mean that the Somerton man died near the home of a woman who had borne his child. It would give the discovery of his phone number in the Rubaiyat a meaning that is not coded or mysterious at all, but simply and heartbreakingly human. And it would still not explain why he died, how he died, who, if anyone, helped him die. It would still not explain the code. The code in the back of the Rubaiyat remains unbroken. Every new generation of cryptographers and hobbyists has attempted to crack it. Modern computational methods have been applied. Pattern analysis, frequency analysis, comparison to known cipher systems of the 1940s. Nothing has produced a definitive decryption. Some researchers believe the code is an initialized shorthand of a personal message rather than a formal intelligence cipher, which would mean it requires knowledge of the writer's personal vocabulary to decode rather than a mathematical key. Others believe it is a genuine intelligence cipher and that the key document was destroyed or never found. If Carl Webb wrote that code, what was he writing? To whom? About what? We do not know. We may never know. What we are left with after 74 years and a DNA breakthrough and all the accumulated research of thousands of people who cared about this case is this. A man named Carl Webb died on an Australian beach on the night of November 30th or the early hours of December 1st, 1948. He died of causes that could not be determined with the technology available and have never been officially established. He was connected in some way to a woman named Jessica Thomson, who refused for the rest of her life to explain that connection. He carried a fragment of Persian poetry in a hidden pocket of his trousers. He was connected to a book that contained an unbroken code, and he chose, or was made, to enter death without a name. The name was found eventually. Everything else remained buried with him. Tamam Shud. It is finished, except it isn't. Not quite, because the questions that Carl Webb left behind on that beach are still alive, still circulating, still pulling people in. The mystery did not end with his identification. It simply became more specific, more human, more haunting. A man with a name, a man with a history, a man who had a wife and a job and a life in Melbourne, and who ended up dead and nameless on a beach in Adelaide, carrying a secret code and a scrap of Persian poetry sewn into a hidden pocket. What happened in the time between his life and that beach? What decisions, what dangers, what relationships, what choices brought Carl Webb to that precise location on that precise night? The beach does not answer. Jessica Thomson did not answer. The code has not answered. And the Somerton man, who is now Carl Webb, who is now a real person with real parents and a real birth record and a real history, remains in many ways exactly as mysterious as the day a stranger noticed him lying peacefully on the sand with a cigarette resting on his collar. Finished, but not explained. Present, but not known. If you stayed with this story to the end, thank you for watching MrPhantom. If this case disturbed you, if the combination of real identity and real mystery and real unanswered questions left you with that particular particular uncomfortable feeling that only true stories can produce, then subscribe, because every story on this channel is real. Every detail is verified. We do not need to invent anything. Reality is stranger and darker and more disturbing than anything we could create. Like this video if the Somerton man stayed with you. Subscribe to MrPhantom so you do not miss what comes next. And the next video on your screen right now is waiting for you, because the next story also has a name, a location, and a beginning. It also has questions that were never answered, and it also happened in the real world, to real people, in broad daylight, in a place where everything should have been visible, and somehow nothing was.